Hey explorers, and welcome back to Pip Explores. And this week we're talking about how to pick out a tent.
When you ain't got no money, you got.
So if you are in the market for a tent, there are a lot of things that you have to consider when trying to decide which one to buy. And I'm going to be talking about both people who are looking to buy a tent for backpacking and people who are looking to buy a tent for car camping. Now, if you don't know what the difference is, you're probably going car camping. So car camping is basically if you're driving to a campsite, unloading, and putting up your tent there without having to carry it into the wilderness very far, you're probably car camping. Backpacking is where you have to carry everything to wherever you're camping. And usually you're not just carrying it to where you're camping, you're hiking a lot and camping in a lot of different spots. So depending on if you are backpacking or car camping, it's going to depend a lot about what features are important to you when picking out a tent. If you're car camping, you probably don't care how much your tent weighs. You don't have to carry it anywhere. But if you're backpacking, your weight of your tent is going to be a major deciding factor. So the first thing you need to decide is, what kind of camping are you doing? Now, there are a lot of different types of tents out on the market. You have trekking pole tents, you have freestanding tents, but the main thing that you need to remember is that a tent's purpose is to shelter you from the elements in some way. But let's talk about the number one thing that my mom always taught me when picking out a tent. So, when you're buying a tent, the floor of the tent can be attached to the top of the tent in two different ways. The traditional way is to have a flat floor and then the walls are sewn at the edges to the top. The issue with that is this puts a seam right at ground level. We don't like that. It's not saying that that seam is the worst thing in the world, but it's not the best, and it's probably the weakest point in your tent. The other type of floor that you can get is called a bathtub floor. Basically, what this means is that the floor curves up and then will attach to the sides at a higher point. This allows the bottom to be one big piece, kind of like a bathtub, so that it helps protect from some of that leakage that might happen. Another thing you have to think about is, do you want a single walled tent or do you want a tent with a separate rain fly? Now, I have both of these types of tents. I'm not gonna lie, I have a lot of tents. But you have to decide which one of those you want to do. So some of the benefits of a single walled tent. Your tent is all one big piece. That's basically what it means. So there's less things to worry about. It's also usually lighter because it's one wall, not two. However, the downside is, you know those lovely summer nights where the air feels like you could choke on it because it's so dense with humidity, and putting your rain fly on your tent is the last thing you want to do, and you know it's not going to rain, so you just want to leave it off so that you can breathe a little easier? You can't do that with a single wall tent. You can like roll up the sides as much as you want. You can try to get a cross breeze going, but at the end of the day, the top's going to be solid. Now, if that's not something that you really care about, that's fine. Do what you want. I'm just giving you information. But with a double walled tent or a tent that has a separate rain fly, that's basically the differentiation, you're going to be able to take that off. Now, granted, that does mean that that tent is going to be heavier. There are more pieces to it, so inherently it's going to be heavier. But it does give you a little bit more flexibility. Another thing is that single wall tents tend to get condensation on the inside of the tent, whereas a double wall tent, on your rain fly, you're going to have the condensation on the rain fly and not directly in your tent. Again, just another thing to think about. And the last consideration we are going to talk about today is, do you want to buy a trekking pole tent or do you want to buy a tent that has its own poles? Again, both have their advantages. A trekking pole tent is great if you're carrying trekking poles, and if you don't need to use your trekking poles during the day if your tent's going to be up all the time. But it can help save weight. If you were already carrying trekking poles, this is a great option for backpackers who hike with trekking poles. But again, if you don't do that, carrying heavy hiking poles to set up your tent, maybe not the best idea. In contrast, a tent that has its own poles, these tents are also called freestanding typically you can have a freestanding tent that's not, it doesn't, it's a whole thing. But typically a tent with its own poles is going to end up being freestanding, which means that you're not gaining the weight savings from using your trekking poles. But if you weren't carrying trekking poles, this could be your lighter option. Tents with poles are also more traditional to set up. So if you're new to camping, a tent with a pole is a little bit more intuitive than setting up a trekking pole tent. I can tell you personally that the first time I set up a trekking pole tent, I did it very wrong. I'm not entirely sure how it didn't collapse on us in the night. And then the next morning we figured out what we had done and we were like, oh. So those are my 3 tips on what to consider when you're buying your first tent or just buying a new tent. What you should look at, what you should think about, and please get a tent with a bathtub floor. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Piff Explores. Don't forget to check out the website, piffexplores.com, and we will see you next week. Bye, guys.